Welcome to my top 10 most compelling costumes for Game of Thrones, this one for the Season 7 Episode 5 Eastwatch. There's only 2 more episodes left in the season, but I will be doing recaps until the end of the summer. And it also looks like Season 8 won't be out until 2019, so I will continue to do character costume videos in the coming months. So don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss anything. I've also received a ton of artwork this week and I was so impressed and delighted. I'll include some of them in next week's recap once I've had a chance to sort through them all. I'm going to be at Fan Expo Canada in Toronto the weekend of August 31st to September 3rd. It's my first event I'm covering for the channel, so I hope to show you some cool things and meet some awesome cosplayers. And hopefully we'll see lots of Game of Thrones costumes. Warning, there will be spoilers in this episode for everything that's happened in the show so far, and most importantly, the new season of Game of Thrones. So come back and watch this after you've seen Season 7, Episode 5. So let's get started with the countdown. I loathe to include Cersei on this list, but here we go. And I'm kind of cheating because we've seen this costume earlier in the season with all of her silver armor. And besides, I have very little to choose from at this point. I also wanted to point out the fit of this gown, and I'd mentioned that her other leather gown was ill-fitting at the top, and I think I've discovered that the problem appears to be the undergarment. And you can see how it cuts in at the top, and I noticed the same thing about Sam's sister Tala Tarly's costume. A viewer pointed out that this ugly leather dress looks kind of like grayscale, which is perfect, I think, since Cersei is certainly rotting from within. As I mentioned in the last video, the top of the gown is puckering, as you can see here. And what this shows is that you need to find the foundation garment that suits the outfit. And a corset, if it's the same type of foundation garment that Cersei wore in Season 1, is probably not the most suitable undergarment for this type of costume. Now, before you get up on me about how I'm picking on the costume department, I'm just trying to point this out from a construction point of view. So even if you make a costume that looks good on a dressmaker's dummy, when you get it on the human body, it will behave differently. Shows like Outlander consider all aspects of the costume, including all of the underpinnings. Here's another view of the costume and the slightly metallic tweed-like texture of the gown. Will we begin seeing Cersei in maternity wear now that she's told Jaime that she's pregnant? The wardrobe team built hundreds of costumes every season just to turn around and trash a good section of them. While most of the credit often goes to the designers, cutters, stitchers, and armorers, the breakdown crew of Game of Thrones has an enormous undertaking, especially in the fallout of the Battle of the Gold Road and the Lannister prisoners of war. In this case, the costumes look like they've been doused with buckets of ash. From the July interview with Time magazine, costume designer Michelle Clapton says of the breakdown process, "We have breakdown, which again is another skill in itself. It's amazing how they can take something that's been beautifully beaded and looks stunning but has no life, and then give it life, give it character, make it relate to the character who's wearing it, what they do, where they've been. It can be quite trashed, but it needs to be, and it's heartbreaking to destroy it, but that needs to happen, and to be bold enough to do that, breakdown is one of the key crafts there." Jaime and Bronn's costumes are no exception, Michelle Clapton says. For all the beauty of the embroidery and the armor, it would be nothing without having been broken down. It makes it real clothing, and that's the essence of Game of Thrones. It's supposed to look real and relate to the person who's wearing it, in the place they're wearing it. This was such an awesome moment, and Charlie at Emergency Awesome referred to this group as the Magnificent Seven. And we know now that the stakes are high, that somebody is likely to be killed. I like the shot of this group dressing in wildling-style clothing because, despite their past differences and backgrounds, they are united in this one mission, and of course their clothing shows this. Yes, it's practical for the weather, but it's also sort of a uniform too. Before they venture out into the cold, Davos, Gendry, and Jorah wear these northern robes. and I especially like Jorah's hooded cloak lined in fur. Jon has ditched his coat of plate and cloak in favor of this wildling attire. Michelle Clapton says of this, he really embraces this northern over-the-wall style, the wildling style, and the reason he embraces it is because it's practical. Kit Harington was delighted that he didn't have the big, heavy cape. This was agile, and he could fight and move, and I think it was a really interesting process just to take him out into this new look. And I'll get more into it next week when Jon and the group battle the White Walkers and the Whites. I wanted to show you this behind the scenes shot as well of the wardrobe crew working on pants, and I think it's for our boys, although they might be for the Whites. This process involves winding fabric threads and little bits of fur on top of a base, creating this layered textured effect. So let me know in the comments if you think that these are wildling pants. Tyrion arrived in King's Landing in this traveling cloak of sorts. It's actually referred to as a surcoat or an overrobe from the Middle Ages that is usually belted around the waist and can have a cape hanging at the back. Tyrion also wore another partial costume with these sleeves made from a nubby-type fabric. The wardrobe team this year have tried to be very frugal with their principal actors, and I think it's because of all the uniforms that were required. According to Clapton, they needed something like 700 uniforms in all, so that would cut into the overall budget. When determining the design, she says, "For the key people, I usually think about how many looks they'll need to get through each season, and then also, are there any new characters or new armies or new places to visit?" Because Clapton has gone with an entirely new palette for the season, they might have dyed some of his costumes from other seasons, otherwise they were pretty much unusable. And you can see how the wardrobe has attempted to use separates, and just by changing out the jerkin or the sleeves to give the feeling that Tyrion has a new costume. This surcoat, it's actually a throwback to the pentoshi style robe he wore in season 5. It's difficult to tell the type of fabric, but the fullness is achieved by gathering the fabric at the shoulders into these very deep knife pleats, in the same way that a kilt gets its fullness. And if you saw my little finger video, you might also recall that this surcoat is made that way too. Not only was I thrilled to see Gendry, but also this fabulous blacksmith costume he wears in this episode. This is a most definite medieval man's garment, a tunic, more properly called a coat. It's made of a broken down leather, bound with contrasting leather around the collar and armholes, and it's grommeted with leather lacing. But more importantly, it's Gendry's warhammer, something that he's made himself, I assume. The hammer has touches of the yellow ochre color and the Baratheon sigil, the stag. This is important because, with the exception of Gendry, House Baratheon is legally extinct. The yellow ochre of his vest and hammer is a nod to his father, Robert Baratheon, and I always welcome some color to the washed-out palette of Season 7. It also shows that while Queen Cersei's court appeared to be in perpetual mourning, the residents of Flea Bottom continue to wear their same clothes. As actor Joe Dempsey says of his character's return, Gendry's been a man biding his time. He's cut off as much of his hair as he can, so he looks less like his father. He's in hiding, but he's allowed himself to be a little proud of his lineage. He's someone who has struggled to know where he fits into society and has been on the bottom rung of it. This has almost made him hopeful. His world has been a very small one, and suddenly it's opened up. It's completely life-changing. Here's a shot of the apron, of course, which he takes off before departing with Davos, and his heavily soiled shirt. And I think that the shirt has a collar, but it's been tucked into the coat. The vest portion of the coat has a center back seam that gives the coat some shaping, since the only other seams are at the side and waist. In this shot, you can see the heavy soiling and the breakdown on the costume. Here you can see Gendry's leather wrist cuffs. You can also see the pleated skirt peplum of the coat. The pleats appear to be inverted box pleats, but without looking at it closely, I'm not 100% sure. Gendry arrives on Dragonstone wearing this spectacular leather doublet. And I'm not sure where he got it from. Maybe Gendry and Davos stopped by his flat in Flea Bottom before getting back in the boat. Or maybe it was tucked in with the dried coconut. Anyway, best not to read too much into it. The coat appears to be leather, bound in a contrasting brown leather, with leather crisscross stitches that cleverly create these tucks at the shoulder. The sleeves appear to be detachable, tied and knotted again with leather laces. We're seeing a transition in Aria's clothing this season. This week, she's rolling out a slightly modified version of her costume from episode 4, and by the end of the season, I suspect, she will be in her full-blown leathers, as we saw on the Entertainment Weekly cover. What is the biggest addition you probably noticed was this fur-lined cloak-style cape, and it's almost like a Greek chlamys, the way this asymmetrical garment is worn over the head with one arm slipping out. It's fastened again in an asymmetrical fashion on the leather shoulder bit with lacing. And she's also added this little bit of armor in the wide belt that she wears over her quilted leather jerkin. Another change is that she's wearing different sleeves from last week, which can be swapped out because of the lacing under the cap sleeves of the jerkin. The sleeves match the tabs of her skirt, like from this photo shoot of Aria's costume from episode 4. In this shot, we get a better look at the cape. The cape is lined in a mottled fur, and the cape fabric itself appears to be a gray knit wool or mohair. And I'm not a knitter, but the pattern is a square print. I think the raised borders of the squares created with the pearl stitch. The square pattern is a repeated motif for Aria. And if any of you knitters are out there, maybe you can comment on what you think that particular stitch is. Here's the Entertainment Weekly cover, but we have yet to see the leather skirt, also with a square pattern. Here are two great examples of high-end faux fur from Active Fabrics in the UK that are similar to Aria's cloak lining. On the left, we have a polar wolf faux fur, and on the right, a gold fox faux fur. And both can be purchased either by the meter or you can purchase it by the 10 centimeter strip. And I think it would also work for Dany's costume as well. It was a difficult week for Sansa, but her appreciation for pretty things is evident in this beautiful gown. Of course, we've seen it before in both the HBO teaser and the Entertainment Weekly photoshoot, so there were no real big surprises here. Again, it's so hard to see because Winterfell is so dark, and unless the characters are in the courtyard or at the weirwood trees, we can't really pick up on the details. Hopefully we'll get a better view soon. And one thing that I appreciated for this episode is that Sansa wasn't wearing her cloak and she just sported her little wolf pelt. Sansa repurposes the belt, which according to Clapton serves as an armor to protect herself against Littlefinger, and her silver circle pendant with her needle. Clapton says of the fabric print, there's an element in the dress of her mother. The pattern is almost like fishes swimming. It's this binding against her vulnerability. It's full of symbolism. Here's the only shot I have of her in her gown without the cape and fur pelt, and sadly, it's behind the text of the Entertainment Weekly cover. But you can see this almost samurai-style collar. The gown is overlapping right over left with the shoulder pieces resembling the lamellar cuirass of the samurai armor. And it's also interesting to note that while Michelle Clapton says that the fabric looks like swimming fishes, I mean, maybe in a severely abstracted way, I think the pattern looks more like the sigil of House Bolton, which is a flayed man hanging upside down on an X-shaped cross. The hourglass silhouette of Sansa's Season 7 dresses, as viewer Professor Cecily pointed out, are similar to the late 19th century gowns. Clapton said in an interview, her dresses are also tightly laced on, incredibly difficult to remove. And given the silhouette, it appears that Sansa is also corseted under her gown. This contributes to her straight posture as well, because the boning makes it difficult to slouch. I'd be curious to know what type of foundation garment Sansa wears, but I know that back in Season 2 she wore this style of stays. Here's an example of this style of silhouette. Pictured here is actress and model Camille Clifford, a favorite model of artist Charles Dana Gibson. The hourglass silhouette defined the Gibson girl ideal style in the late 1800s. Her blouses are more pigeon style, bloused above the belt, but you get the basic idea, especially in the belted outfit in the center and on the right. Moving into colder weather, Dany has a new outfit. She actually wore it back in the episode Spoils of War while riding Drogon, but it was such a brief glimpse at the costume that I didn't bother to include it last week. I will state, however, that I think it was a bit ridiculous, that she's flying the equivalent of a 747 while wearing a coat dress, even if it has a bit of fur lining to it. And to add to the suspension of disbelief, she looked absolutely pristine and without any kind of dirt as she arrived to burn the Tarly boys to a crisp. Anyway, let's move along. Here's a good look at the outfit. It has the Cobra-style collar implemented into the dress, with a right-left crossover asymmetrical style cut, again with the Asian inspiration. According to Clapton, the collar is intended to be Dany's version of armor. The fabric appears to be herringbone or a zigzag motif. There was some suggestion that played homage to Jon Stark's sigil, but I found that a bit of a leap, and I think it might be more representative of a chevron pattern that we keep seeing in the costumes. I'll get more into that in the next episode. And as far as the fur trim on the collar and lower sleeves, which are mimicking Jon's, sure, there is that, but we should also remember that Varys also wears a similar style costume. You might also recall that in a previous video that a viewer pointed out to me the similarity of Dany's costume to the Mongolian deal, which is a traditional garment for both men and women, and the winter deal, it's often lined or trimmed in fur. The construction of this dress is pretty complicated, and the reason is because there are a variety of things going on. Most of this would have been worked out in the initial mock-up, perhaps after a few fittings with actor Emilia Clarke. And Clapton has said that Dany's dresses take the longest to complete of any character. So here, the collar is actually seamed into the dress, like a princess seam, but there is an additional angle seam on the side front, just under the arm. And the majority of the shaping comes from these long princess seams in the front seen here. And in the back seen here. An additional tapered seam at the center back creates this amazing structured curviness. I think whoever cut this gown also cut Littlefinger's gowns because the inverted chevron technique is also used on Littlefinger's collars. A detail that I find mind-boggling is this attempt at lining up the zigzag pattern at each seam. Finally, the large vent at the back of her dress gives it a more coat-like quality, but it's also a necessity for flying dragons. From the back, it looks a bit Wyatt Earp. You can't see in any of my pictures that the front of the dress is slightly shorter, wraps around the back, and the hem angles down into a bit of a point in keeping with her waist seam. The fabric on the left is a black herringbone velvet from Mood Fabrics in New York, and I thought that it was a close likeness to Dany's coat dress fabric. I know many of you have been curious as to how the show gets its fur. Clapton says, we'll work with the furrier to see if we have to weave any fur. We mix fake and real fur. We try to use fake as much as we can. And Clapton has also said that she sources vintage furs and rarely, if ever, uses new fur. On the right is an example of a high-quality faux fur that she might have used. While expensive, this chinchilla faux fur from Active Fabrics in the UK can be purchased by 10 centimeter strips, and it's actually 1.5 meters wide, which is pretty wide. So if you're interested in any of these fabrics that I've showed for cosplay, I'll leave a link in the description below. Well, Sir Jorah Mormont showing up in medieval finery to impress his lady love, Daenerys Targaryen. I was hoping that there might be one costume held back, something that wasn't teased in the promos, and I finally got it. Other thing I liked is that it's not black. To me, it looks a little bit like chocolate brown. The first thing we see, of course, is this lovely cape. It looks like it's linen, but it might be raw silk or even a blending of the two. And I know it's very long and full because you can see where they seamed the panels together. I honestly don't know where everyone keeps getting their clothing from this season. Maybe there was an armor maker in Old Town. Here's a shot of Jorah saying goodbye to Dany, and you can see that his sleeves have rows of bear-type fur, that's from his family sigil, between the bands of leather strips, and you can see the studded leather plates of his armor. In this shot, Jorah's cape, it almost looks sort of gray instead of brown. Here's a good shot of the top of Jorah's studded armor, presumably made from boiled leather. And just for fun, I recently learned that boiled rawhide makes a very good armor that is both flexible and can repel weapons. But unfortunately, very few historians have been able to recreate the process that provides a textile that is suitable for armor. Tan leather, on the other hand, offers no protection from sharp objects whatsoever. In a behind-the-scenes video, actor Ian Glenn is revealed to be wearing this jerkin with detachable sleeves under his armor. A bit of a signature for Jorah, he always wears some type of knotted scarf around his neck, like this black and gold one seen here. A little bit of bling for Dany. You can see in the lighting that there is an incredible amount of breakdown, which only really works in the dimly lit show. And one of the things that Clapton does exceptionally well as a designer is all of the layers and textures that give the costume depth. The camera has a tendency to flatten the costumes, so what might look great in person won't translate well to your TV screen, even if it's high def. What costumes did you enjoy seeing the most this week? Are you hoping to see something before the end of Season 7? Let me know in the comment section below. I'll be back next week for another recap video. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you soon.